Imagine setting out on a journey into a frozen wilderness with nothing but your supplies and courage, and waking up to find yourself completely alone, cut off from the world. This is the story of an expedition that vanished, leaving only footprints in the snow and whispers in history books. The winter of 1820 had arrived with a quiet, unrelenting frost that seemed to seep into the very bones of those who dared to step outside. In a small coastal town, tucked between jagged cliffs and icy waters, Captain Henry Caldwell paced the floor of a modest wooden inn. His mind was a whirl of calculations, maps, and possibilities. Tomorrow, he would lead an expedition into the unknown Arctic wilderness, a place where few had ventured and fewer had returned. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, heavier than the thick coats he and his men would wear against the biting cold. Caldwell's team consisted of 10 men, each chosen for their particular skills. There was Thomas, the navigator, whose hands never trembled when charting the course across treacherous ice; Samuel, the hunter, whose eyes could spot a movement in the snow from half a mile away; and Jacob, the engineer, whose ingenuity had repaired broken sleds and rigged makeshift tools for every previous journey. Alongside these men were others whose strength, endurance, and experience promised the chance, though slim, of survival. They were to be joined by a small group of sled dogs, hardy creatures bred for the cold and trained to pull their heavy loads through miles of snow. The preparation had been meticulous. Supplies were packed with care: barrels of dried meat, bags of hardtack, and small quantities of grain for emergencies. Each man carried a personal kit: knives, flint, needles, and thread, along with thick blankets and spare clothing. The sleds themselves were reinforced to endure the sharp ice, each corner bound with iron bands. Maps were spread across the inn's wooden tables, inked lines tracing rivers, frozen lakes, and distant peaks that few had seen in winter. Every route was studied, every risk weighed. Yet, even with all the planning, Caldwell knew that the Arctic had a way of making human knowledge feel insignificant. As the evening sun dipped behind the jagged horizon, painting the sky in muted shades of orange and purple, the townsfolk gathered near the harbor. They whispered amongst themselves, eyes wide with concern and curiosity. Some had seen expeditions fail before, men returning half-crazed, bodies frozen and minds scarred by the relentless cold. Mothers clutched their children, husbands clasped wives' hands tightly. Warnings were whispered to Caldwell as he passed. "The ice moves differently than your maps show," one old fisherman said. "Storms can come without warning, Captain. The land, it does not forgive mistakes." Caldwell nodded politely, though inside, a knot of anxiety tightened. The warnings were not unfamiliar, but hearing them, knowing the risks, only heightened the tension that already hummed like electricity through the inn. By dawn, the men were ready. The first light fell over the frozen tundra, turning the snow into a glistening expanse that stretched as far as the eye could see. Captain Caldwell led his team out, each step leaving a crisp imprint on the unbroken snow. The dogs barked and strained against their harnesses, sensing the journey ahead, muscles coiled and ready. There was a brief, almost sacred pause as the men and animals alike faced the vast, silent wilderness. It was as if the land itself was watching, measuring their resolve, waiting to see if they were worthy. The first miles were deceptively calm. The cold bit at their cheeks and fingers, and the wind carried a sharpness that cut through layers of wool and fur. Yet, there was also a strange beauty, a quiet majesty that made every man feel both insignificant and alive. Their sleds creaked under the weight of supplies, the dogs' paws sank into soft snow, and the rhythmic sound of movement over ice became a strangely comforting heartbeat against the vast silence. Caldwell walked slightly ahead, eyes scanning the horizon, already calculating the next few miles, the possible dangers, the paths they would need to navigate once the snow thickened and the ice became treacherous. Even as they moved forward, small tensions began to surface. The cold was more intense than some had anticipated. A misplaced step could mean plunging into hidden crevasses. The men spoke little, conserving energy, each silently testing his endurance against the elements. Caldwell occasionally broke the silence with instructions or encouragement. His voice firm but calm, a steadying presence amidst the unknown. The dogs, trained for months, responded to their commands with eager precision, pulling the sleds along the frozen expanse, seemingly unafraid of the wilderness that surrounded them. Despite the preparation, nothing could erase the awareness of uncertainty. Each man carried his own private fear, of the unknown, of failure, of never returning home. And yet, mingled with that fear, there was also a profound sense of purpose. They were explorers, men who would leave a mark in the chronicles of history if they survived. Every step, every breath of icy air, reminded them that the journey ahead was not just a test of skill, but of courage, resilience, and the human spirit itself. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the snow, the expedition pressed on. Behind them, the town receded into the distance, a warm memory fading as the wilderness enveloped them. Ahead lay the unknown, a world both beautiful and merciless, waiting to challenge them at every turn. Captain Caldwell knew that the decisions made in the coming days could mean the difference between survival and tragedy. And so, with the wind at their backs and the ice under their feet, they stepped forward, into a world where every choice mattered, and every moment could be the difference between life and death. The first days of the expedition had brought a sense of accomplishment, even exhilaration. The men had adjusted to the cold, the rhythm of the sleds, and the biting wind had become almost familiar, a constant companion rather than an enemy. But nature, as it often does, reminded them that familiarity was a dangerous illusion. By the third day, the weather began to turn. The sky, once clear and pale blue, darkened with a bruised gray that seemed to press down upon the frozen landscape. Winds that had been sharp but manageable now howled with an eerie intensity, carrying stinging snow that cut through their thick coats and into the exposed parts of their faces. Captain Caldwell, scanning the horizon, felt a knot of concern tighten in his stomach. The snow began to fall in heavy, swirling flurries that obscured the landscape. A blizzard had arrived far earlier than anticipated, catching them mid-journey. The men tightened their grip on the sled ropes, shouting commands to the dogs as the wind threatened to scatter their team. The dogs themselves whined and strained against the harnesses, their sharp eyes darting for familiar markers now hidden under a blanket of white. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and every step forward became a careful calculation, a gamble against the treacherous ice below. The terrain revealed its deceptive nature quickly. What looked solid under a fresh layer of snow could conceal hidden dangers, thin ice stretching over deep, frozen crevices, or hidden patches of slush ready to swallow a sled and its supplies in an instant. One false step sent Thomas, the navigator, tumbling knee-deep into a concealed pool of icy water. Shivering and wet, he scrambled out, muttering under his breath as Caldwell and the others helped him regain his footing. Minor injuries began to accumulate: bruises, frostbitten fingers, and scraped shins. Small but constant reminders that even the slightest lapse in attention could have serious consequences. Morale, once high with the thrill of adventure, now began to fluctuate. Men whispered in corners of the sleds, questioning decisions, debating whether they should press forward or seek temporary shelter. Arguments were brief but tense. Survival had a way of amplifying fear, and fear often manifested as impatience or irritation. Yet Caldwell remained a steady presence, moving among the men, offering encouragement and guidance. "Keep moving," he would say, his voice firm against the howl of the storm. "Step by step, one at a time." His calmness did not erase their fear, but it gave them something tangible to hold on to amidst the chaos. The blizzard forced the team to rely on instincts honed over months of preparation. The men took turns scouting ahead, their eyes straining to discern safe pathways. Every shadow, every ridge, every uneven patch of snow had to be analyzed quickly. The dogs, trained for these conditions, provided crucial warnings, whining or bristling when the ice beneath them felt weak, or when unseen obstacles threatened to topple a sled. Even so, fatigue began to creep into their bones, each day of relentless cold and uncertainty sapping strength and resolve. As the storm raged on, Captain Caldwell realized that time itself seemed distorted. Minutes and hours blended into an endless white expanse. The sun, barely visible through thick clouds, offered little orientation. Nights became a battle against hypothermia, the men huddling in makeshift snow shelters while wind whipped the ice around them, rattling their tents and bending the poles like twigs. Sleep was fitful, Dreams were filled with slipping into endless chasms or being buried beneath walls of snow. When morning came, it often felt like the night had barely ended. Despite the hardships, small victories punctuated their days. A frozen creek provided water when melted over carefully managed fires. A cluster of hardy vegetation yielded edible roots, a rare supplement to their limited rations. These tiny successes reminded them why they had embarked on this journey in the first place, not merely for exploration, but for survival, for mastery over a landscape that did not forgive weakness. Each step forward, no matter how small, was an assertion of human determination against a vast and indifferent wilderness. Yet, with each challenge, the stakes increased. Minor injuries, once a nuisance, now threatened more serious consequences. Frostbite began to set in on fingers and toes, forcing men to adjust gloves and boots constantly. Exhaustion made judgment slower, reactions delayed, and one misstep could have catastrophic results. A slip on a hidden patch of ice, or an unnoticed crack in the frozen river, could mean being stranded alone, perhaps permanently. These were not distant fears. They were immediate and pressing upon every man with the weight of inevitability. By the end of the 5th day, it was clear that the expedition had entered a new phase. No longer was this a journey defined by anticipation and curiosity. It was now defined by endurance, resilience, and the raw struggle to survive. Each man carried his own private burdens, the memory of family left behind, the nagging fear of what awaited ahead, and the ever-present knowledge that the Arctic did not forgive errors. And yet, despite the cold, the blizzard, and the constant threat of danger, the men pressed onward, step by careful step, driven by the unspoken understanding that retreat was not an option. Not if they hoped to leave a mark upon the frozen world, not if they hoped to live to tell the tale. The early challenges of the expedition had proven one undeniable truth. Nature would not yield, and the human spirit would be tested in ways no map could predict. As the wind screamed across the snowfields and the blizzard refused to relent, Captain Caldwell and his men moved forward, each step a testament to courage, endurance, and the fragile, burning hope that they could survive what lay ahead. By the 6th day of their journey, the Arctic landscape had begun to feel less like a silent partner and more like a looming adversary. The blizzards of earlier days had left the snow uneven, layered in dangerous pockets that tested the careful attention of the men. But what troubled Captain Caldwell and his team the most now was not just the ice or wind. It was the unsettling feeling that something was slipping away from them, quietly, almost imperceptibly, until it could no longer be ignored. It began with the dogs. 2 of the sled dogs, hardy animals trained for months to endure the punishing cold, vanished without a trace. One moment they had been pulling the sleds with practiced strength and focus, the next they were gone, leaving only paw prints trailing off into the white expanse. At first, the men searched frantically, calling their names into the wind, but the howling blizzard swallowed their voices before they could travel far. The dogs did not return. Their absence was more than an inconvenience. It was a signal that even the creatures bred for survival in this frozen world were vulnerable. The team's morale, already strained, began to wobble. Food supplies, once carefully rationed and deemed sufficient for emergencies, were dwindling faster than expected. The blizzards had slowed their progress, turning what should have been straightforward travel into exhausting treks over treacherous ice. Each extra hour on the trail meant more calories burned, and the team quickly realized that they would have to stretch their remaining rations further than they had ever anticipated. The dried meat and hardtack that had seemed plentiful now seemed pitifully small against the vast, unyielding wilderness that surrounded them. Even Jacob, the engineer, known for his ingenuity and resourcefulness, frowned as he calculated how long the food might last if the storms continued. Tension began to creep into every interaction. Men whispered behind hands, exchanging worried glances. What if more dogs disappeared? What if a sudden blizzard trapped them for days without enough food? Questions that had been theoretical only hours before had now become urgent, pressing fears. Captain Caldwell called a meeting to address the growing unease. Around a small circle, huddled against the wind and snow, the men debated whether to continue or turn back. Some argued for pressing forward, pointing out that turning back now would not guarantee safety either. They had already crossed dangerous terrain and exhausted much of their energy. Retreat could be just as perilous, if not more so. Others were hesitant, their voices tinged with fear. "We've lost 2 dogs already," one man said. "If the weather worsens, what hope do we have? Are we prepared to risk everything for pride?" His words, simple and honest, hung heavy in the wind. Arguments, though brief, were sharp. Minor disagreements began to surface, fueled by exhaustion and fear. Samuel, the hunter, insisted that they could forage if necessary, pointing out the sparse vegetation and frozen wildlife that could provide emergency sustenance. Others argued that every detour to hunt or search for food increased the risk of being trapped on unstable ice. The debate, while respectful, revealed cracks in the cohesion of the group, a reminder that human endurance is tested not just by nature but by the pressures and conflicts within a team. Meanwhile, the psychological tension grew in ways more subtle than arguments or lost dogs. Men began to experience brief moments of disorientation, their minds playing tricks under the monotony and harshness of the frozen landscape. Shadows shifted in the periphery of vision. Distant sounds of cracking ice and shifting snow were interpreted as approaching dangers. Sleep became a rare commodity, and even when they rested in makeshift snow shelters, the wind's howl seemed to seep through their consciousness, leaving them tense and alert even in moments of stillness. Captain Caldwell understood that these psychological strains could be as dangerous as the ice itself. A single lapse in judgment could lead to disaster. Misstep onto thin ice, failure to secure supplies, or a miscalculated route could mean injury or death. He moved among the men constantly, checking boots for frostbite, inspecting sleds, offering quiet reassurance. His presence was a stabilizing force, but even he could not shield them from the creeping sense of vulnerability that permeated the group. The environment seemed almost to mock their efforts. The ice beneath the sleds, once a reliable pathway, had begun to show signs of stress. Cracks spiderwebbed across frozen lakes, sometimes hidden by fresh snow, a deadly trap for anyone unaware. Small avalanches had shifted minor snowdrifts, and hidden crevices swallowed equipment or forced men to retrace their steps carefully. Every step forward required attention, courage, and constant vigilance. As the day progressed, it became clear that the expedition had entered a precarious phase. They were no longer merely explorers charting unknown territory. They were survivors, navigating a landscape that seemed to sense weakness and exploit it. The loss of the dogs and dwindling food were not isolated problems. They were warnings. Nature was testing them, forcing them to confront not just the harshness of the Arctic, but the limits of their own endurance, patience, and teamwork. Even so, small acts of courage kept the group moving. Jacob rigged a makeshift sled repair using spare wood and leather straps, ensuring they could continue carrying supplies despite the loss of the dogs. Samuel managed to track a small herd of Arctic hares, providing a momentary boost to their dwindling rations. These victories were modest, yet they were enough to remind the men that hope persisted, even in a frozen wilderness that seemed determined to strip it away. As night fell, the temperature plunged further, and the storm that had begun in the morning showed no signs of abating. The men huddled together in the safety of their snow shelters, sharing whispered observations and quiet reflections. Captain Caldwell, standing watch outside, gazed at the endless expanse of white, understanding that the challenges ahead would only intensify. He knew the expedition's fate depended not only on skill and preparation, but on the ability of each man to remain steadfast in the face of growing fear, dwindling resources, and the harsh, unrelenting landscape that surrounded them. The signs of danger had arrived, unmistakable and unyielding. Lost dogs, scarce food, and fraying nerves were a clear message. Survival would demand every ounce of courage, ingenuity, and resilience they possessed. And as the wind continued to howl across the ice, Captain Caldwell and his men understood that the Arctic would not grant mercy, and every decision, every step, would carry weight beyond measure. By the 8th day, the expedition had already endured more than any of the men had imagined possible. They had faced biting winds, treacherous ice, dwindling rations, and the unsettling disappearance of 2 sled dogs. Yet, nothing could have prepared them for the fury of the Arctic that awaited. That morning, the sky, deceptively calm at first light, darkened with alarming speed. A blizzard swept across the frozen expanse, its intensity catching the men mid-journey. Visibility dropped to nearly zero, and the whiteout made even familiar landmarks vanish as if swallowed by the endless snow. Captain Caldwell, leading the front group, immediately sensed the danger. Commands shouted into the wind were barely audible. The storm seemed almost alive, a roaring wall of snow and ice intent on testing their resolve. The men struggled to keep the sleds on track, their footing treacherous on patches of ice hidden beneath freshly fallen snow. Within minutes, the blizzard had done what no minor injury or fatigue had accomplished. It separated the expedition into smaller groups. Some men were swept off course, sleds diverted by hidden ice ridges or forced to detour around snowdrifts taller than themselves. Panic threatened to take hold, but Caldwell forced himself to remain calm. The separation was immediate and terrifying. Thomas and Samuel, once close at the front, found themselves isolated behind a rising ridge. Jacob and a few others were carried by the wind toward a narrow frozen river, struggling to keep their sleds upright as the storm battered them from all sides. The men were forced to shout, to wave, to signal, but the blizzard's deafening roar swallowed every sound. It was a brutal reminder that in the Arctic, nature dictated every movement, and human control was often an illusion. Caldwell, determined not to let fear overtake the men, took stock of his own group. He moved quickly, ensuring that those closest to him remained visible and connected. His voice, steady and authoritative, cut through the storm when possible. "Stay together. Watch the ice. One step at a time," he called, though even he doubted whether the scattered groups could hear him. The wind carried both snow and anxiety, mixing into a haze that made the simplest tasks, keeping sleds aligned, ensuring dogs didn't panic, extraordinarily difficult. Night approached faster than anticipated. The blizzard showed no sign of easing, and with visibility near zero, the men were forced to make a critical decision: push forward blindly or stop and build shelter until the storm passed. Caldwell, ever pragmatic, chose survival over speed. They halted in a shallow depression, a slight natural hollow that offered minimal protection from the wind. The men set about building snow shelters, hollowing out spaces against drifts, reinforcing them with spare wood and sleds, and creating small entrances to minimize the intrusion of icy gusts. Each shelter was a fragile cocoon, yet it offered the only hope of surviving the night. Inside their makeshift snow fortresses, the men were forced to ration what little food remained. Each morsel of dried meat, each crumb of hardtack, was measured with painstaking care. Jacob carefully divided the supplies, balancing caloric needs with the psychological comfort of shared portions. Conversation was sparse. The men were exhausted, both physically and mentally. Frostbite nipped at fingers and faces, the cold relentless even inside the shelters. Yet they spoke occasionally, whispering words of reassurance, sharing plans for the morning, or recounting brief memories from home to remind themselves of life beyond the frozen wasteland. The separation weighed heavily on every man. Fear was no longer just about survival in the harsh environment. It had transformed into anxiety about their companions. Each isolated group feared that the others might be lost forever, swallowed by the storm. Caldwell struggled to maintain not only physical control of his own group, but also the morale that bound them together. He walked among the shelters, checking boots, reinforcing walls, offering quiet encouragement, and reminding them that they must conserve energy, ration supplies, and rest when possible. Leadership was no longer about direction. It was about presence, about instilling courage where doubt threatened to dominate. Sleep came fitfully, snatched in short intervals between the howl of the wind and the occasional cracking of ice in the distance. Dreams were haunted by the blizzard, by images of men drifting alone across the white expanse, by sleds overturned and supplies lost. When morning arrived, the storm had not relented entirely, but it had shifted enough for them to cautiously assess their surroundings. Tracks in the snow revealed where the other groups had gone, providing faint hope that they might reunite. Caldwell studied these signs carefully, plotting the safest path to reconnect with the scattered members. The first separation had left an indelible mark on the expedition. It was a stark lesson in the Arctic's unforgiving nature. No amount of preparation could eliminate the unpredictable power of wind and snow. Yet, even amid fear and uncertainty, the men adapted. They had learned to trust their instincts, rely on one another in small groups, and respect the landscape in a way that only adversity can teach. The blizzard had divided them physically, but it had also strengthened their resilience, forcing each man to confront the raw truth of survival. Endurance was not just measured by distance traveled or obstacles overcome, but by the ability to persist when all certainty was stripped away. Captain Caldwell understood that the storm had merely introduced the first of many challenges. The Arctic, relentless and indifferent, would continue to test them in ways both seen and unseen. The night separation, the harsh struggle to build shelters and ration food, and the anxiety over lost companions were only the beginning. Yet, in the quiet moments inside their snow shelters, the men discovered a strange sense of unity. The shared struggle created bonds that could not be broken, even by distance or wind. Each man, despite exhaustion and fear, found within himself the courage to endure, step by painstaking step, through a world that had made survival its highest challenge. As the storm's howl gradually softened, Captain Caldwell gazed out over the frozen landscape. The separation had forced difficult choices, but it had also revealed something vital: their will to survive. Though divided, though battered by wind, snow, and uncertainty, the expedition continued, moving ever forward into the unknown, one careful step at a time, ready to face whatever dangers lay beyond the next ridge. The morning began with a deceptive calm. After the night of blinding snow and howling wind, the men cautiously emerged from their makeshift snow shelters. The blizzard had softened, leaving a quiet, almost eerie stillness over the frozen landscape. The Arctic, however, is never truly still. Beneath the seemingly peaceful surface, danger simmered, waiting for the slightest misstep to unleash its fury. Captain Caldwell led his group carefully, scanning the slopes and ridges, mindful of the unpredictable behavior of snow that had been freshly deposited over uneven terrain. It happened without warning. A section of a nearby slope, heavy with the accumulated weight of wind-blown snow, suddenly gave way. A low rumble, barely audible at first over the crunch of their boots, quickly grew into a deafening roar. The men barely had time to react before a wall of snow cascaded down the hillside, sweeping part of the expedition into a white, swirling torrent. Thomas and Samuel, who had been scouting ahead, were immediately engulfed, their shouts muffled as the avalanche carried them downward. Caldwell, frozen for a fraction of a second, sprang into action, signaling the remaining men to move to higher, safer ground. The scene that unfolded was terrifying. Snow piled against rocks and trees, forming a chaotic landscape that concealed men and sleds alike. Caldwell knew that time was critical. Every second could mean the difference between life and death. "Stay calm. Move carefully. Keep your lines tight," he shouted, his voice cutting through the storm. He and the remaining men quickly assessed the situation, determining who had been caught and where the snow was most unstable. Panic threatened to take hold, but Caldwell's steady command forced the group to focus on immediate survival rather than fear. The first task was digging out the trapped men. Using shovels, sturdy branches, and bare hands where necessary, the team began to clear the snow. Each scoop was exhausting. The snow was heavy, packed tightly from the force of the avalanche. The wind still howled around them, making every motion a battle against the elements. Frostbite and numbness slowed their progress, but the urgency of the moment pushed them forward. Caldwell coordinated the effort, assigning men to specific areas, ensuring that ropes were anchored to stable points, and that no one risked slipping into hidden crevices beneath the snow. Survival tactics became a matter of life and death. Where possible, the men used ropes to secure themselves and others, creating lines to pull out those trapped. Improvised signals, taps on the snow, shouted counts, ensured that no one's position was lost in the white chaos. Every decision carried weight. Dig too slowly, and the buried men could suffocate. Dig too recklessly, and the rescuers could be swallowed in a secondary collapse. The Arctic demanded precision and courage, and the men responded, driven by the will to save their companions. Amid the physical exertion, the psychological strain was equally intense. Thomas, partially buried but conscious, shouted for help, his voice strained and trembling. Samuel, pinned by a sled, tried to free himself, fear evident in his wide eyes. The men felt despair creeping in, the cold and snow pressing against them from all sides. Yet, hope flickered persistently. Every hand that grasped another, every rope that held firm, every shovel that displaced a mound of snow, was a testament to human resilience. Caldwell reminded them constantly, "We will get them out. Step by step. Keep faith." Hours passed, though time itself seemed suspended in the avalanche's aftermath. Exhaustion weighed heavily, and muscles screamed from effort, but they continued, driven by the cries of their trapped companions and the unspoken bond that had formed among the men. Small victories, a hand found, a foot freed, a sled upright, gave brief relief and bolstered morale. Each rescued man was a triumph, a reminder that courage under stress and careful planning could prevail even in the face of overwhelming odds. The avalanche also forced them to confront their own vulnerability. The snow had shown them that even the most careful preparation could be undone in an instant. Men whispered prayers, recounted memories of home, and gripped one another's shoulders for reassurance. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside. The fear, the despair, the fragile hope that persisted despite the overwhelming challenges. Caldwell understood that leadership in moments like these was not only about directing action, but about providing emotional stability, instilling courage, and preventing panic from spreading like wildfire. As the last man was pulled from the snow, a hush fell over the group. The immediate danger had passed, but the Arctic had left its mark. Bruises, frostbitten hands, and exhausted faces were the visible scars. The invisible ones, the lingering fear, the knowledge that at any moment disaster could strike again, remained. Yet, there was also pride. The men had survived, worked together, and emerged stronger in their resolve. The avalanche had tested them to the core, and they had met the challenge. By nightfall, they found a small plateau, slightly sheltered from the wind. Exhausted but alive, they set about building temporary shelters once more. The men moved quietly, each absorbed in thoughts of the day's ordeal, sharing sparse words but acknowledging the effort and courage of each companion. The night was spent huddled together, rations divided with care, the warmth of human presence offering comfort against the relentless cold. Caldwell remained vigilant, keeping watch in shifts, ensuring that even in sleep, no one was left entirely vulnerable. The avalanche had changed the expedition irrevocably. It was a harsh reminder that survival in the Arctic was not a linear journey, but a constant struggle, demanding ingenuity, resilience, and courage under conditions that would break the unprepared. Yet, amid the fear and despair, hope endured. The men had faced the white chaos together, emerged alive, and understood that each moment of survival was a victory worth savoring, however brief. They had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the determination to act despite it, and that even in the face of overwhelming odds, hope could be carved from the coldest, heaviest snow. Days had passed since the avalanche, and the expedition's ordeal had entered a grimmer phase. Supplies, once carefully rationed and stretched across each member of the team, were now dangerously low. The dried meat, hardtack, and handfuls of grain that had seemed sufficient at the journey's outset were all but gone, leaving the men to measure every crumb, every morsel, with painstaking care. Hunger gnawed relentlessly at their stomachs, a constant reminder that survival was no longer a distant possibility. It was a daily, pressing struggle. Each day became a careful calculation. How far could they travel, how much could they consume, and how much energy would be required to endure another freezing night? Frostbite, the invisible enemy that had crept along their fingers and toes in the early days, now spread with greater intensity. Hands and feet, exposed to the relentless cold, became stiff and painful, the skin discolored and numb. Simple tasks, holding a sled rope, handling a knife, even tying boots, became arduous exercises in endurance. Men winced with every movement, the sharp sting of ice and blood pumping through frozen limbs a constant companion. The cold was not just physical. It invaded their thoughts, slowing reasoning, fogging judgment, and amplifying every fear. Psychological strain began to take hold. The monotony of the snowbound landscape, the isolation, and the creeping exhaustion created fertile ground for hallucinations. Some men swore they saw figures moving at the edge of their vision, shadows of companions who had long since drifted away or mirages of distant mountains. Others imagined distant towns, the warmth of home, the smell of fires and cooking, visions that were both comforting and cruel reminders of what they had left behind. In whispered corners of their temporary shelters, men confessed these illusions to one another, sharing stories that blurred the line between reality and imagination. In the rare moments of solitude, many turned to writing letters. Each man pulled out scraps of paper, ink smudged from frozen fingers, and wrote to loved ones. These letters were intimate confessions, filled with hope, fear, and memories of home, letters they knew might never be delivered. The act of writing became a lifeline, a way to anchor themselves to the world beyond the frozen expanse. Some wrote hurriedly, shaking from cold and exhaustion, pausing to listen for signs of movement outside or to reassure themselves that they were still alive. Others wrote slowly, each word a deliberate effort to preserve clarity in the fog of fatigue and hunger. These letters, personal and poignant, revealed the depth of human emotion when confronted with the possibility of death and isolation. The emotional and mental struggles of the men became as critical as their physical survival. Hunger, frostbite, and exhaustion eroded patience and optimism, leading to small but sharp disagreements. A slight misstep, a dropped tool, or an accidental spill of a rare ration could spark tension. Yet, these moments were tempered by camaraderie, by the shared understanding that each man's survival depended on the cohesion of the group. Captain Caldwell moved among them constantly, offering reassurance, administering aid where possible, and reminding them to conserve energy, to ration what remained, and to hold on to hope. The Arctic, unrelenting and indifferent, seemed almost sentient in its cruelty. Every gust of wind, every hidden crevice, every icy slope was a reminder that the environment did not bend to human will. The men learned to read the landscape with precision, observing snow patterns to anticipate hidden dangers, judging ice thickness by subtle visual cues, and listening to the faintest sounds that could signal danger. Yet, even with skill and vigilance, the threat of injury, illness, or accidental separation remained ever present. The physical and psychological demands fed into one another, creating a cycle of stress that threatened to overwhelm even the strongest among them. Night brought little relief. The men huddled in their snow shelters, the cold penetrating even through layers of cloth and fur. Shivers racked their bodies as they attempted to sleep, muscles stiff from frostbite and exhaustion. Dreams were vivid and unsettling, visions of home, of food, of warmth intermingled with images of lost comrades, falling into crevices, or being buried under snow. When awake, they struggled to focus, sometimes forgetting the simplest tasks or misplacing vital tools. Yet, amidst this fog of despair, moments of clarity and courage emerged. Small acts, a shared piece of ration, a reassuring touch, a whispered plan for the next day, became lifelines, preserving not just life but the fragile threads of hope that kept them moving forward. Caldwell understood that their endurance hinged on both mind and body. He encouraged the men to speak openly about their fears, to write letters, and to share small victories. Even something as simple as successfully starting a fire or melting snow for water became a psychological triumph. These victories, while minor in isolation, collectively reinforced the team's resilience. Each man realized that survival was not solely about physical strength. It was about the ability to endure mentally, to resist despair, and to act decisively even when hope seemed distant. By the end of the day, the men had learned to navigate not just the frozen wilderness, but the terrain of their own minds. Hunger, frostbite, and hallucinations had forced them to confront vulnerability in its rawest form. Yet, the act of enduring, of continuing despite overwhelming adversity, had forged a quiet determination within each of them. Letters were tucked away, rations measured carefully, and every decision, no matter how small, was executed with the weight of consequence fully understood. In the Arctic, survival was never guaranteed. But in the hearts and minds of Captain Caldwell and his men, a quiet, persistent hope endured. It was a hope built on courage, on the resilience of the human spirit, and on the unspoken promise that they would continue to face the frozen expanse together, step by painstaking step, through hunger, frostbite, and the isolation that threatened to consume them. The struggle for survival had entered its harshest stage yet, and the men knew that only by enduring both body and mind could they hope to see the light of the world beyond the ice once more. The Arctic landscape had grown both familiar and terrifying in equal measure. By the time Captain Caldwell's expedition reached a series of frozen lakes and rivers, the men had learned that nothing could be taken at face value. What appeared to be solid, unbroken ice could conceal treacherous cracks, hidden currents, or thin layers that gave way under weight. Each crossing demanded not just physical strength, but sharp judgment, intuition, and an acute awareness of the environment's subtle signs. The frozen waters were deceptive, a mirror of calm masking the lethal unpredictability beneath. The first crossing came unexpectedly. A broad, glistening lake stretched before them, smooth as glass, reflecting the pale Arctic sky. The team paused at the edge, the dogs sniffing cautiously, paws tapping against the snow-laden ice. Captain Caldwell examined the surface, tapping it with a pole, listening for hollow sounds that might betray hidden weakness. The men watched in tense silence. Every step they took could be the difference between survival and disaster. Cautious at first, they tested the ice in small sections, distributing weight carefully. Sleds were pulled slowly, ropes tied for safety, and each man communicated constantly. The tension was palpable. Hearts raced with every creak, every subtle crack. The slightest misstep could plunge a man into icy water, where hypothermia would set in within minutes. Every breath seemed louder, every heartbeat more insistent, as if the frozen expanse itself were counting their pulses. Despite caution, some men felt the irresistible urge to push forward faster. Samuel, the hunter, confident in his experience and strength, decided to take a more direct route across the center of the lake, ignoring the tentative tests near the shore. The ice, thin in places, groaned under the pressure of sleds and bodies. A sharp, echoing crack split the air, sending a shiver down the spines of those watching. For a terrifying moment, Samuel and his sled teetered on the edge of disaster. Captain Caldwell shouted instructions, grabbing ropes and rallying men to secure lines. With sheer determination and quick action, Samuel was pulled back to solid ground, his sled intact but the near miss leaving everyone shaken. Other crossings proved equally perilous. Narrow rivers, partially frozen and concealed by snow, required delicate navigation. The team's ingenuity was tested. They used branches as probes, distributed weight along multiple sleds, and anchored themselves to trees and rocks where possible. Each crossing was an exercise in calculated risk, the stakes higher with every step. Men held their breath as they stepped forward, ears tuned to the subtle creaks, the faint splashes beneath the snow, the distant crack that warned of collapsing ice. One miscalculation could mean falling into the freezing water, the icy current carrying them away before anyone could intervene. The psychological toll of these crossings was immense. The constant awareness of danger, the unrelenting cold, and the near misses compounded the exhaustion already building in each man. Fear and adrenaline mingled in a heady, almost disorienting mix. Some men froze, paralyzed for seconds that felt like minutes, while others pushed forward recklessly, spurred by desperation or frustration. Captain Caldwell recognized the delicate balance. Too much caution could slow them dangerously, but recklessness could prove fatal. His leadership became a constant negotiation between instinct and reason, guiding his men while preventing panic from spreading. As they pressed on, the environment tested them further. Snowdrifts covered cracks that were revealed only at the last moment, and sudden gusts of wind made balance precarious. A small group had to cross a river whose ice was deceptively smooth but hollow beneath. Midway across, the ice buckled under the weight of the sled, dropping one edge slightly and sending a shock through the men. Quick thinking and precise coordination were required. Ropes were secured, sleds adjusted, and the group moved in synchrony to distribute weight evenly. The crisis was averted, but the adrenaline spike left them all shaking, their nerves raw from repeated exposure to imminent danger. Amid the physical dangers, emotional strain intensified. Men whispered reassurances, shared memories of home, or muttered prayers under their breath. Each crossing was not just a test of skill, but of trust. Trust in their companions, in the dogs, in their own judgment, and in the fragile ice beneath their feet. Fatigue and hunger exacerbated tension, minor disputes flaring over pace, route choice, or ration distribution. Yet, through these trials, camaraderie deepened. Each life-saving maneuver, each successful crossing reinforced bonds that were stronger than fear itself. By the end of the day, the team had crossed multiple lakes and rivers, each with its own unique perils. The men were battered, frozen, and hungry, yet alive. They had faced near death repeatedly, and each survival reinforced a fragile confidence. Captain Caldwell knew that this was only the beginning. The Arctic had many more trials ahead. Yet, the crossings had proven something essential. Meticulous preparation, vigilance, and courage under pressure could stave off disaster, even when nature seemed intent on claiming them. That night, as the team huddled in snow shelters near the last crossing, silence settled over them. Exhaustion was complete, but so was a sense of achievement. They had survived the ice, the hidden rivers, and the constant threat of plunging into freezing waters. Yet, the tension lingered, an invisible thread connecting each man to the landscape, to the ice beneath their feet, and to one another. The Arctic remained a formidable adversary, indifferent and unyielding, but the men had taken their first step toward mastering it, not through brute force, but through skill, teamwork, and unrelenting perseverance. Every man understood the lesson the frozen waters had taught. In this world, survival depended on courage, careful calculation, and the ability to act decisively in the face of imminent peril. Each crossing, each nearfall, each crack in the ice had left its mark, both on their bodies and on their minds. And as they drifted into a restless sleep, the memory of the day's dangers remained vivid, a constant reminder that in the Arctic, certainty was an illusion, and every step forward was a triumph over forces far greater than themselves. The frozen expanse stretched endlessly before the men, a seemingly uniform white world that had tested their endurance, courage, and sanity at every turn. Yet, as Captain Caldwell and his team pressed onward, the Arctic revealed that even in its harshest emptiness, surprises awaited, some promising hope, others serving as stark warnings. It was on the 9th day of their journey that the first of these revelations came, and with it, a mixture of awe and dread that would linger in their minds long after the snow had swallowed the traces of the past. While navigating a narrow pass flanked by jagged cliffs, Samuel's keen eyes caught something unusual in the snow, a dark shape half buried, partially obscured by wind drifts. At first, it seemed indistinct, almost like a shadow cast by the cliffs themselves. But as the team approached, the reality became undeniable. It was the remains of a previous expedition, a grim reminder of the Arctic's unforgiving nature. Rusted sleds, tattered clothing frozen stiff, and skeletal traces of men and dogs told a silent, horrifying story. The sight sent a chill deeper than the cold ever could, a visual echo of mortality in a landscape that demanded respect. Caldwell approached cautiously, his mind racing. The remains were not fresh, but they were recent enough to serve as a warning. Every man examined the scene with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Notes and journals, partially preserved by the cold, hinted at decisions gone wrong, rations miscalculated, and paths taken that had led to disaster. The silence of the site was deafening, a stark contrast to the howling wind outside. It was as if the previous expedition's fate had been frozen into the ice, waiting to speak to those who dared follow in their footsteps. The psychological impact was profound. For a moment, the men hesitated, their progress slowed by the weight of what they had seen. Conversations dropped to whispers, eyes darted nervously at the surrounding cliffs. Yet, Caldwell understood that fear, while natural, could not paralyze them. He spoke softly but firmly, reminding the men of their training, preparation, and experience. "This is a warning, yes," he said, "but it is also a guide. We learn from them, where they went wrong, what to avoid, how to survive. Let us honor their journey by moving forward with care and vigilance." The discovery also prompted practical action. The team scavenged the site cautiously, finding small, overlooked supplies that had survived the years. Preserved bits of food, fragments of tools, and pieces of cloth that could serve as insulation or repair materials. These small gains, though minor in comparison to the overall dangers, provided a glimmer of hope in an otherwise relentless landscape. Every recovered item was carefully stored and rationed, a reminder that even in despair, the Arctic could offer unexpected aid. Not far from the grim remains, the men made another, more promising discovery. Hidden natural shelters, small caves partially concealed by snow and ice, offered temporary refuge from the wind. Caldwell's experience told him that these formations, though limited, could be life-saving in sudden storms or during extended travel across unstable terrain. The men explored each nook and crevice, testing for stability and usability, reinforcing where necessary with sled components and spare timber. The discovery transformed what had been a tense, morale-draining day into one infused with cautious optimism. For the first time in days, the men felt a sense of control over at least a small part of the environment, a fragile victory over the Arctic's overwhelming indifference. Food sources, too, revealed themselves in unexpected ways. Under the ice and snow, patches of hardy Arctic vegetation, previously overlooked, offered minimal sustenance. Roots, edible moss, and occasional traces of small animals were carefully collected. While insufficient to replace rations entirely, they provided a psychological boost, a reminder that survival required observation, ingenuity, and adaptability. The men realized that the landscape, though merciless, had subtle provisions for those willing to seek them out. Each small bite, each discovered shelter, became a victory, no matter how modest. Yet, with hope came renewed fear. The remains of the previous expedition were never far from their thoughts, a constant reminder of mortality in a place where mistakes could be fatal. The men moved cautiously, aware that their own survival depended not only on physical endurance but on mental clarity, vigilance, and the ability to respect the land. Every crossing, every climb, every decision was now weighed against the silent warnings left in the snow. The Arctic had taught them to survive, but it had also taught them to anticipate danger, to measure every risk, and to act decisively when uncertainty threatened to consume them. Emotional tension blended with practical survival. The team shared reflections around small fires in their temporary shelters, recounting the discoveries and the lessons they offered. Letters were written in whispered tones, notes to loved ones capturing thoughts of fear, gratitude, and perseverance. The presence of the previous expeditions remains infused these writings with a heightened awareness of impermanence and fragility. Every word written, every action taken, reinforced the lesson that survival was as much about preparation and resilience as it was about hope and courage. As night fell, the Arctic's vast white silence seemed to embrace them, both comforting and intimidating. The team huddled within one of the discovered shelters, the cold still biting, yet their spirits buoyed by the day's discoveries. The duality of hope and fear, the grim reminder of mortality alongside tangible tools for survival, kept them alert, thoughtful, and engaged. Caldwell, ever vigilant, maintained watch, observing the faint movements of snow and ice, ensuring the team was ready for whatever challenges might arrive with the coming day. The day ended with a quiet reflection. The Arctic had shown its capacity for both danger and providence. The remains of the past expedition warned them of what could happen if caution faltered. The hidden shelters and modest food sources offered a path forward. Hope and fear intertwined, pushing the men to remain vigilant, resilient, and united. And as they drifted into uneasy sleep, each man carried in his heart the lessons of discovery, lessons that would guide them through the trials yet to come, step by careful step, across the frozen, merciless expanse. By the 10th day, the Arctic had claimed most of the expedition's strength. Only 2 men remained alongside Captain Caldwell, Thomas, the navigator, and Samuel, the hunter, each battered by frostbite, exhaustion, and the unrelenting demands of survival. Their faces were etched with fatigue, hands and feet were swollen and numb, and every breath carried a sharp sting of cold. The ice beneath their boots creaked ominously, and the wind whipped relentlessly, tearing at their already tattered clothing. The landscape, which had once seemed a blank canvas for exploration, had become a crucible, testing the very limits of human endurance. The trio pressed forward cautiously, aware that any misstep could be fatal. Every ridge, every frozen river, and every snow-laden slope presented dangers magnified by fatigue. Their movements were slower, more deliberate. The sleds that had once been pulled with strength and confidence now required careful negotiation over treacherous ice. Captain Caldwell monitored his companions constantly, watching for signs of frostbite worsening, of energy draining too quickly, and of morale faltering. He knew that the final stretch of their journey would demand not just physical resilience, but mental fortitude as well. The weather intensified. Snow swirled in thick clouds, reducing visibility to mere feet. Gusts of wind knocked the men off balance, forcing them to cling to the sleds and ropes for stability. Each breath was a battle against the sting of freezing air, each step a careful calculation to avoid the thin ice hidden beneath the snow. The Arctic had transformed from a silent challenge into an active adversary, pressing relentlessly against their bodies and minds. Every inch forward was earned through sheer determination. Hunger and exhaustion amplified the danger. Rations were virtually gone, and the men's bodies screamed for sustenance. The cold sapped strength with every step. Muscles burned and trembled, fingers stiffened, and minds wandered dangerously close to despair. In these moments, hallucinations appeared, faint whispers on the wind, distant shadows moving through the snow, and the imagined warmth of home. Caldwell, though equally fatigued, remained the anchor, guiding his men with calm authority and clear instructions. Every decision was critical. Hesitation could mean losing a life. The expedition faced its harshest choices yet. The trio approached a particularly unstable section of ice covering a deep, frozen river. The ice groaned under the sled's weight, and Caldwell recognized that not all could cross safely together. He assessed his men, noting their energy, alertness, and strength. It became painfully clear that a decision had to be made, one of life and death. To continue together risked all three plunging into the freezing waters below. To split up might allow at least one man to survive and seek rescue or guidance for the others. The discussion was tense, whispered over the roar of the wind. Thomas, his face pale and lips cracked, spoke first, volunteering to stay behind if it meant giving the others a better chance. Samuel hesitated, torn between loyalty and survival instinct. Caldwell weighed every factor carefully, aware that any choice carried irreversible consequences. "We move forward cautiously," he said, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "One will lead, one will follow, and one will remain to secure the sleds and guide us back if necessary. Every step must be deliberate, every movement calculated." They prepared meticulously. Ropes were fastened with extra care, sleds reinforced where possible, and communication methods established for any contingencies. Caldwell instructed the man staying behind to remain in the safest possible location, to conserve energy, and to be ready for retrieval. The Arctic demanded not just courage, but planning. Every precaution could mean the difference between life and death. The crossing was harrowing. Caldwell led the way, testing every step with his pole, listening for hollow sounds that might indicate thin ice. Samuel followed closely, careful to place each foot exactly where Caldwell had, while Thomas stayed behind, monitoring the sleds and marking the safest route with stakes and small flags. The ice groaned, shifting beneath their weight, and the wind threatened to push them off balance at every moment. The tension was almost unbearable. One slip could undo all their careful planning. Midway across, a sudden crack split the ice ahead. Snow erupted in a jagged line, sending icy shards flying. Caldwell froze, assessing the width of the fracture and the stability of surrounding ice. Samuel gripped his sled, muscles straining to maintain balance. The seconds stretched endlessly, every heartbeat amplified against the frozen silence. With calm authority, Caldwell directed Samuel to shift weight and adjust their path, carefully navigating the broken ice. Each movement was precise, deliberate, and executed under immense pressure. Emerging from the treacherous section, both men exhaled in relief, the adrenaline temporarily overriding their fatigue. Thomas signaled from behind, confirming that the sleds and supplies were secure. The reunion, however brief, was tinged with the bitter awareness of how close disaster had come. The Arctic had forced them to confront mortality directly, and the choices they made had saved lives while testing the limits of human endurance and ingenuity. As night fell, the men established a temporary shelter, exhausted but alive. The wind continued to howl, and frostbite burned through their numb extremities. Yet, in the quiet moments around a small, protected fire, there was also a profound awareness of their accomplishment. They had survived where others might not have, navigated lethal terrain, and made agonizing decisions with clarity and courage. The Arctic had pushed them to the brink, stripping away all illusions of safety or certainty, and revealed the raw, unfiltered essence of survival. Captain Caldwell reflected on the day's trials, knowing the final stretch was yet to come. Extreme weather, exhaustion, and dwindling resources had pushed the men to the edge, testing their limits physically, mentally, and emotionally. Each decision, each careful step, had been a matter of life and death. And yet, despite the pain, fear, and uncertainty, the men had endured. The Arctic had demanded everything, and they had answered, one deliberate, courageous step at a time. The Arctic, relentless and indifferent, had tested Captain Caldwell and his remaining companions to the very edge of human endurance. After days of blizzards, avalanches, starvation, and near-constant peril, the trio's journey had become a testament to resilience, courage, and sheer willpower. By the time dawn broke on the 10th morning after their final struggle, the landscape around them seemed impossibly vast and empty, yet that same emptiness held a faint glimmer of hope, the possibility of rescue, of survival beyond the frozen expanse. The wind had calmed slightly, and with it, the oppressive tension that had clung to their every step began to ease, if only a little. Visibility improved, revealing snow-covered ridges, frozen rivers, and jagged cliffs that had loomed like silent sentinels over their journey. Caldwell knew they had to move carefully, but he also sensed that time was no longer an enemy. It was a fragile ally. Each measured step carried the potential to bring them closer to salvation. Every breath, heavy with cold and effort, was a reminder that survival had already been a monumental victory. The faint, distant sound of movement through the snow caught Thomas's ear first. At first, it was barely distinguishable from the whisper of wind across the ice, but as they paused and listened, the sound grew clearer, the unmistakable crunch of boots and sleds moving over hard-packed snow. Caldwell signaled for silence, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. Moments later, the silhouette of a small search party appeared, emerging from a low ridge like a vision. Relief washed over the men in waves, mingled with disbelief. They were not alone. Rescue had come. Approaching cautiously, the men greeted the newcomers with hoarse voices and shaking hands. The rescuers, themselves prepared for the harsh conditions, brought warmth, medical supplies, and the promise of food and shelter. Caldwell's group, emaciated, frostbitten, and exhausted, allowed themselves to lean on the support, for the first time in days releasing a fraction of the tension that had gripped their bodies and minds. The sleds were secured, the remaining supplies loaded, and the trio carefully guided onto the rescuers' transport. Every step felt surreal, the stark white of the Arctic now contrasted by the presence of life and human connection. Medical attention was immediate. Frostbite was assessed, minor injuries treated, and energy restored with warm fluids and provisions. The men lay in blankets, muscles trembling not just from cold but from the release of stress and fatigue accumulated over nearly 2 weeks of unrelenting struggle. Sleep, long denied, came in short, blissful bursts, and dreams were tinged with relief rather than terror. Yet, even as their bodies recovered, their minds grappled with the enormity of what they had endured. Every decision, every step, and every harrowing encounter had been a negotiation with death itself, and they had survived. Caldwell, Thomas, and Samuel spent hours recounting the journey to the rescuers, describing the avalanche, the perilous crossings, the dwindling rations, and the hallucinations brought on by starvation and cold. Each story was punctuated by silence, reflection, and occasional shivers that were as much from memory as from lingering cold. The rescuers listened with a mix of professional focus and awe, recognizing that this was more than survival. It was a demonstration of human endurance at its most extreme. The expedition's ordeal was not just a tale of navigating ice and snow. It was a profound chronicle of courage under circumstances designed to break even the strongest spirit. Letters, written in the Arctic under conditions of extreme deprivation, were finally retrieved and safeguarded. Each one was a testament to the emotional depth of the journey, the longing for home, the hope that someone would receive the words, and the acknowledgement of mortality in a world that had demanded everything from them. For the men, these letters became symbols of their resilience, reminders that even in the harshest isolation, humanity could persevere through expression, connection, and the act of reaching beyond oneself. Caldwell reflected on the expedition's trials with quiet gravity. The Arctic had been unforgiving, claiming companions, challenging skill and judgment, and exposing the limits of endurance. Yet, the lessons were profound. Preparation, vigilance, teamwork, and mental fortitude had been just as critical as physical strength. Each man had confronted fear, despair, and uncertainty, and had emerged alive because they adapted, supported one another, and refused to surrender. Survival was not simply the continuation of life. It was an affirmation of resilience, a recognition that human spirit could endure even when all odds seemed insurmountable. The rescue party guided them to a temporary base camp, where warmth, food, and medical care provided a stark contrast to the relentless cold and hunger they had endured. There, amidst the practical necessities of recovery, Caldwell and his men allowed themselves a moment of reflection. They spoke of the companions lost, the dogs that had vanished, and the harsh decisions that had marked the journey. Tears mingled with laughter as they recounted near misses and the moments when courage had eclipsed fear. The Arctic had shaped them, leaving indelible marks on body, mind, and spirit. As night fell over the base camp, the men gazed at the Arctic horizon. The vast whiteness, once oppressive and threatening, now seemed almost reverent, a reminder of the trials they had overcome. Each ridge and frozen river was a chapter in their shared story, a story of danger, endurance, and the delicate balance between despair and hope. They had faced the unimaginable, confronted the limits of human capacity, and emerged alive, carrying with them lessons that would remain for a lifetime. Caldwell understood that survival was not simply about reaching safety. It was about what they had discovered within themselves. Courage was measured not just in bold actions, but in the quiet persistence of moving forward when all hope seemed lost. Resilience was found not only in strength, but in cooperation, trust, and the refusal to yield to fear. And hope, fragile yet enduring, had been the guiding force through every blizzard, every avalanche, every crossing of uncertain ice. The Arctic had demanded everything, and the expedition had responded. In the stillness of night, surrounded by warmth and the presence of others, Caldwell and his men allowed themselves to finally exhale. They had survived not just the frozen landscape, but the psychological, emotional, and moral trials it imposed. Rescue had brought them back to safety, but the journey had left an indelible imprint, a testament to the endurance, courage, and unyielding spirit that define human survival in its most extreme form.